Disclaimer: movie screenshots, footage, and music is owned entirely by their respective copyright holders. I make no claim of ownership of any footage or music in this video. Hello everybody, it's Azza and welcome to 80's Portal. Now today we are actually making a video I once made a while ago, and this is actually my third attempt at making it because I want to finally make the ultimate version of this video. Now this is my top 20 favourite horror films of the 1980s. Now the 1980s was of course known for its horror films, and there was great progression in gore, makeup effects, and just what you could present on screen. So without further ado, let's get into the top 20 80s horror films. The first film we have for 1980 is The Shining. The Shining is an adaptation of the Stephen King novel by the same name. It is about a man named Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, and his family who stayed in the haunted Overlook Hotel during the closing season, as Jack has gotten a job position as a caretaker. He sees this as a perfect opportunity to write his novel, with the fortitude of the hotel being a perfectly quiet place. However, as the family's stay becomes more unnerving due to the spirits that reside, Jack begins to lose his mind, and begins to go down the same path of madness as the previous caretaker, Delbert Grady, who had murdered his family with an axe. The film has a very ambiguous feel to it. Not much is explained, and much of it can be seen in different interpretations. This is not surprising, considering the film was directed by the one and only Stanley Kubrick. The Shining was Stanley Kubrick's one and only horror film, and it is a testament to how excellent he was as a director. And his one and only horror film turns out to be one of the best. This is an amazing film, and I really recommend it. So the second film we have for 1980 is The Fog. The Fog is another ghostly film, and it takes place in a community called Antonio Bay, and the people who live there are getting ready to celebrate the centenary of the town. However, not many people know that there were many hardships and many deaths that came with the founding of Antonio Bay, including the ruthless murders of a ship filled with lepers, whom the founders sank into the ocean. And now, on the 100th anniversary of not only the town's founding, but also of their deaths, the lepers return to Antonio Bay to wreak havoc on the town, arriving with a thick layer of fog which they create with their ghostly ship. This film was directed by John Carpenter and was produced by Deborah Hill. If those names sound familiar, it's because these were the people who made 1978 classic Halloween. This is easier to see when you consider that many of the actors and actresses from Halloween have returned, including Jamie Lee Curtis, Nancy Kyes, and Charles Cyphers. This is a really spooky movie with some interesting questions asked. If a bunch of murderers built something wonderful, should they be praised more or shunned more? It's an amazing film with some really tense moments, and I really recommend it. Now we go to 1981 with Sam Raimi's gory masterpiece. The Evil Dead is about four friends who go to an abandoned cabin in the woods for a vacation. Upon exploring the basement, they find multiple things, most notably a disturbing book with a face and a reel-to-reel tape recorder with marked tapes. When they listen to the tape, they are told that the book they have is called the Necronomicon, which roughly translated means Book of the Dead, and that it was bound in human flesh and written in human blood. When the tape says out loud a strange incantation, everything goes wrong. Each friend, one by one, gets possessed by a being known as the Kandarian demon, and are turned into creatures called the Deadites. By the end, only one of the friends, named Ash Williams, is the only one left human, and he must survive until dawn. This film is directed by Sam Raimi. Yes, the same Sam Raimi who directed Spider-Man, and caused quite a lot of controversy when it came out, due to the graphic violence and a certain scene where one female friend is assaulted in the woods by an evil spirit. Raimi has since said he regretted putting the scene in. Regardless, the film is a masterpiece, and is astoundingly well made for a low-budget indie flick. It is a hell of a ride, and you won't want to miss it. For our second film of 1981, we have Joe Dante's The Howling. The Howling is one of three main werewolf films of 1981, including Wolfen and An American Werewolf in London. The film is about Karen White, played by Dee Wallace, after she has had a traumatic event. In an attempt to help the police catch a wanted serial killer, she lured him to an X-rated theatre where he showed her the films of him killing his victims, only before he transformed into a werewolf. The killer gets away, but the police are still on him. Karen's therapist refers her to a place called the Colony so she can cope and take her mind off the situation. However, not as all as it seems. It is not only revealed that the killer, Eddie Quist, followed her to the place of sanctuary, but everyone there is also a werewolf. This film is directed by Joe Dante. most known for Gremlins, and has a fun cameo by Dick Miller, who showed up in almost all of Dante's films. The special werewolf effects were done by Rob Bottin. Originally, Rick Baker was going to do the effects for The Howling, but he declined, instead doing effects for An American Werewolf in London. Both films have amazing effects, but The Howling is definitely more of a scary film, compared to American Werewolf in London, which is more of a comedy. It's an amazing monster film, and the scene where Quiz transforms into a werewolf is unforgettable. I would definitely recommend a watch. And now we move on to 1982 with Basket Case. Basket Case is a low-budget indie film about two brothers, one of which is a deformed Siamese twin named Belial, who used to be attached to his brother Dwayne's side. When they were 12 years old, their father paid 3 doctors to separate the two of them, which nearly killed Belial. Both survived, however, killed their father, and went to live with their aunt. Years later, Dwayne and Belial begin to track down the doctors that separated them, and murder them out of revenge. The reason this film is called Basket Case is because Dwayne carries Belial around the city in a wicker basket to keep him concealed. The film was directed by Frank Hellenlotter, and the film was filmed over the course of a year because production couldn't afford to make it in one sitting. That's how low budget this film was. Over time, Hellenlotter got many friends and family to help make Basket Case a reality. From the strange acting choices to the over-the-top gore, Basket Case is a feast for the eyes, one that should definitely be watched. A high recommendation. Our next film for 1982 is The Thing. The Thing takes place in Antarctica in 1982, at an American research station. The film opens with a husky being chased down by 2 Norwegians. Ultimately, the husky makes it to the American base. However, this is no ordinary dog, as it has been assimilated by a strange alien being that can take the form of any living thing. This causes a big dispute and a massive divide in the group as to who or may not be human. Eventually only 2 people are left, which has left fans divided on whether either person is human. The Thing was directed by John Carpenter and is a remake of the 1951 film The Thing from Another World. The film was also scored by Ennio Morricone, who is most famous for scoring the Dollars trilogy, such as Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly from the 1960s. The effects again were done by Rob Bottin, and they are a mix of beautiful and horrific. There is a scene where someone dies of a heart attack, and it is then revealed that they were a thing when they try to use a defibrillator on him. This is an amazing film, and I very highly recommend it. Right, so now we move to 1983, and our first film is Christine. Christine is a Stephen King adaptation about a killer 1958 Plymouth Fury. It virtually seduces a teenager called Arnie into loving it more than anything else. This causes Arnie's entire social life to come crashing down, losing his girlfriend and best friend, and it ultimately ends in him being driven insane by the car. Christine is our third outing on the list to be directed by John Carpenter, which shows how amazing of a director he is. Funnily enough, the rights of the films were given to Carpenter before King had fully published the book. It stars Keith Gordon as Arnie, who you may recognise as one of the teens from Jaws 2, and it also stars John Stockwell as Dennis, who you may also recognise from his brief appearance in Top Gun. Christine is a really well-made film that deserves more recognition. I give it a high recommendation. Our next film from 1983 is Kujo, another Stephen King adaptation. It's about a friendly St. Bernard named Kujo who gets bitten by a rabid bat, and slowly begins to deteriorate until he is a ruthless killing machine. Much of the film follows Donna Trenton, played again by Dee Wallace, as she goes through a complicated affair with the repairman. Ultimately, she and her son are left outside a mechanic named Joe Camber's house, who owns Kujo, in their car with a snarling dog outside. This film is really intense at times, thanks to the talented dogs on set and the human performers as well. The production crew had to tie down the dogs' tails so they didn't wag, since they were so happy to be on set. They even used a man in a dog suit for some shots. It's an amazing film with impressive effects, and I really recommend it. Right, so now we're getting on to my favourite year of the 80s, 1984. And what better film to start off with than my favourite Jason film? Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is part 4 in the 12 movie series, so it very much is not the final chapter. It stars a pre-Goonies Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis, a nerdy kid who makes Savini-esque monster masks. And it also stars a pre-Back to the Future Crispin Glover as Jimmy, a horny teen who basically just wants to get laid.
That is the entire reason the teens are at the Jarvis Lodges in this film. They aren't counsellors at a summer camp, they're just a bunch of teens looking to fuck. Nice and simple. This film has effects done by the master of effects, Tom Savini, which explains why Jason's face in this film has the most continuity with the young Jason from the first film. If you're looking only to watch one Friday the 13th film to get a feel of the franchise, Part 4 is definitely the way to go. Okay, so my next film from 1984 just so happens to be one of my favourite films of all time, The Toxic Avenger by Troma Entertainment. Now, the creator Lloyd Kaufman has said that this isn't solely a horror film, but that it just has horror elements. That's good enough for me though, I couldn't resist putting this on the list. This film is about an innocent nerd named Melvin, who gets bullied by everyone in town, including a group of bullies. Now, I must mention, these guys aren't just bullies, they are borderline psychopathic. They literally run over a 12-year-old's head, which bursts like a f***ing watermelon. That was cut out of the TV version. One day, the bullies trick Melvin into wearing a tutu and ballet leotard, where he jumps out of the window and lands in a barrel of toxic waste. This mutates him into a lazy-eyed, bulky monster known as the Toxic Avenger, but fans have nicknamed him Toxie. Toxie is hideous, but hilariously, he has the most beautiful voice on Earth, sounding like He-Man. With this new persona, Melvin becomes a superhero, protecting the people from the criminals of New Jersey. If you couldn't tell, I am a massive fan of this film, so please go and check it out. So, coming out of the best year of the decade, we come into the second best year of the decade, with 1985. Our first film from 1985 is Return of the Living Dead. Upon hearing the title, you may think that it's a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, but you would be mistaken. There are only a few references. The whole film takes place in a cemetery where a teen named Freddy, played by Tom Matthews, is working in a medical warehouse nearby. He works there because it feeds his morbid curiosity. One day, his superior tells him a story that the film Night of the Living Dead was based on a real case where the US government used a gas called 2,4,5-trioxin to reanimate the dead. This story is true in universe, as the barrels used to contain the corpses are kept in the basement of the warehouse. When showing Freddy the barrels, they accidentally release the gas, bringing everything in the warehouse back to life. When they try to burn the bodies, the gas rains down on the cemetery, bringing more corpses to life, whilst Freddy's punk friends arrive. What ensues is a bad situation getting progressively worse over the course of the film. The interesting thing about these zombies is that they break the traditional rules for the Romero zombies. Normally, if you destroy the brain, the zombie is out of action. However, with these zombies, it's the nerves which are infected, so therefore every part is independent. Chop off their arm, and the arm will try to kill you. This raises the stakes and makes it almost impossible to kill the zombies without continuing the cycle of burning them and then raising more. This is a darkly hilarious film, which I definitely recommend. Our next film of 85 is The Stuff. The Stuff has one of the most nonsensical plots in movie history, but still turns out to be a hilarious and fun ride. It's about a mysterious goo which is found at a quarry. The guy who finds it turns out to be a complete f***ing weirdo, as his first instinct is to eat it. Surprisingly, he finds that it tastes really good, with it being sweet and addictive. Soon after, we see that it's been patented and sold as The Stuff. Still, nobody really knows what it is. At some point, The Stuff even manages to outsell ice cream, which causes the major companies to hire industrial saboteur, played by Michael Moriarty, to investigate and see what it is that makes the stuff so addictive. What ensues is a bunch of interconnecting plot lines involving the superfood, including a 12-year-old boy who has his own suspicions about the superfood. The effects in this film are fantastic, using sets such as revolving rooms and miniatures to show how extreme the stuff can become. It is a hilarious film which is so bad it's good, and I absolutely recommend it. Now we move on to 1986, where we will first be looking at Demons. Demons is an Italian film which takes place in a cinema in Munich. Two girls go there and are given free tickets to a horror film. In the lobby there is a mannequin of a knight on a motocross bike holding a metal demon mask. A prostitute puts it on and scratches herself. Later on, she notices the scratch doesn't stop bleeding. In the restroom, her cut begins to bubble up and she turns into a yellow-eyed snarling demon puking up green ooze. As the night progresses, more and more people get possessed, and our heroes must find their way out of the cinema. It's also important to mention that everything that happens in the film they're watching happens in real life, such as the demon mask making an unhealing scratch that possesses that person. Demons was produced by Dario Argento, most famous for directing Suspiria and producing Romero's Dawn of the Dead. And it was also directed by Lamberto Bava, son of Mario Bava, who 15 years earlier directed the giallo film A Bay of Blood, commonly referred to as the first ever slasher film. This film is amazing and a great example of European cinema. I highly recommend it. Okay, so now we get into my second favourite film on this list, Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive. This film is about a comet that passes over Earth and leaves a large amount of residual radiation. This radiation causes a lot of electrical and powered devices on Earth to go on a murderous rampage. The thing we stick with the most is the lorries, as much of the film takes place at the Dixie Boy truck stop, where several people are stranded by the roaming trucks. There is a memorable scene where a boy is riding his bike through a suburb, only to find that everyone has been killed by whatever they were using. A girl is seen dangling out of the window with a hairdryer alongside her, and a man is sat on a porch swing with the headphones on, covered in his own blood. This film is special, as it isn't just any old Stephen King adaptation, but it's the one and only film that King himself directed. After watching The Shining and disliking it, he decided to take this film into his own hands. What we got was a somewhat goofy but hilarious time. It even has a pre-Simpsons Yeardley Smith, who plays Lisa. It's a hell of a ride and I can't recommend it enough. Okay, now for 1987. Our first film of 1987 is Hellraiser. Now, a fair warning, this film can be considered not safe for work to some degree. It's about a man named Frank who wishes to dive deep into the world of sexual pleasure. Eventually, his travels bring him to a puzzle box called the Lament Configuration. When he solves the box, chains come out and tear him to shreds as he is dragged to hell by a group of sadomasochistic demons called the Cenobites, led by Pinhead, played by Doug Bradley. Much of the film is about Frank manipulating his brother's wife into killing men for him so that he can regenerate his body. The film was directed by Clive Barker, who made this film as an adaptation of his own novel, The Hellbound Heart. In a time filmed with horror comedies, Hellraiser's intention was to scare the shit out of viewers. Well, it definitely did me when I first saw it. The effects are of David Cronenberg levels of grotesque. Very graphic, but an amazing film and a high recommendation. Our next film on this list is The Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is about two teenage boys, Michael and Sam, who move to a smaller community called Santa Carla, the murder capital of the world, with their mother after a fairly hefty divorce. What the boys soon learn is that there is a coven of teenage vampires who feast on the people of Santa Carla during its energy-filled nightlife. What results is Michael becoming a vampire and Sam teaming up with the nerdy Frog Brothers who own a comic shop to take down the vampires and free Santa Carla of its infestation. The film stars Jason Patric, Kiefer Sutherland, Corey Haim and Corey Feldman, and was directed by Joel Schumacher. If that name is familiar, it's because Joel Schumacher is the same man that brought us Batman Forever in 1995 and Batman and Robin in 1997, the latter of which is considered by many to be one of the worst comic book movies of all time. This film is not bad though, in fact it's amazing. It just shows that when you leave Joel Schumacher to make a film he really wants to make, it can turn out to be amazing. I highly recommend The Lost Boys. It is a fun, terrifying time. Right, so now we'll move on to 1988 with another film from the master of horror John Carpenter. They Live is about a man named Nada who finds a pair of cosmic sunglasses which shows the world to him how it really is. When putting on the glasses, he sees that humanity has been enslaved by an alien race, being controlled by subliminal messaging, instructing people to be passive to authority and become greedy and consume. What's even worse is that the alien beings who happen to resemble decaying humans are masquerading as the people who are either in power or better off in the world. Ultimately, Nada decides to rise up and take back the world from the alien invaders with the help from his friend Frank. As previously mentioned, They Live was directed by John Carpenter and definitely has more of a sci-fi edge to it with some horror elements thrown in, but for me that counts. It stars Roddy Piper of WWF fame as Nada and Keith David as Frank, which we have previously seen playing Childs in The Thing. This film has a reputation for having a long drawn out fight scene between Nada and Frank, where Nada tells Frank to put on the glasses to see the truth for himself. This fight scene was in the Guinness Book of World Records at the time for the longest fist fight in movie history at 6 whole minutes. This film is amazing, with one of the most quotable lines ever.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum.
A very high recommendation. Our next film for 1988 is Child's Play. Child's Play is the film that introduced the world to the killer good guy doll Chucky. A serial killer called Charles Lee Ray is gunned down while on the run from the police, but before he dies, he says an incantation which transports his soul into a doll. A while afterwards, a woman named Karen buys the good guy doll from a homeless peddler, as her son Andy wants one for his birthday and she cannot afford one. Chucky makes it his mission to transport his soul into Andy's body, killing many people along the way. This film was directed by Tom Holland and was written by Don Mancini. Chucky wouldn't explode in popularity until the 90s, but he made his start in 1988, and what a start he made. Chucky is genuinely fucking terrifying in this film. From using a voodoo doll to stab a man to death, to chasing the 6-year-old Andy with a voodoo knife after being burned to a crisp, Chucky is one mean f***er who you don't want to mess with. A high recommendation. Alright, so we have made it to the last year of the 80s with 1989. We have two quite depressing films for the last year, appropriately so, as it is the last year of the best decade in my opinion. Firstly, we have Pet Sematary. This is our final Stephen King adaptation of the decade. It is about a doctor named Lewis Creed, as he moves to a new home next to a busy motorway. As a result of this motorway, it was common for children's pets to be killed by oncoming traffic, so the kids of the area had built a special cemetery to bury their beloved pets. However, we find out that beyond the bushes of the pet cemetery, there is another one, which was used by the Micmac tribe to resurrect their loved ones. When the family is on a trip, the family cat gets run over and killed. Lewis decides to bury the cat in the Micmac cemetery to ensure the cat still lives. When the cat comes back, it is aggressive and violent, and also smells terrible as it is still decaying. Things go back to normal until tragedy strikes. Lewis's 3-year-old son gets hit by a big rig. Lewis decides to do the same thing to Gage as he did to the cat, resurrect him with the Micmac cemetery. Ultimately, Gage comes back as a violent, murderous toddler. This film is really emotional and has some amazing acting to drive home how devastating the losses of the family are. It is a good film, but not one to watch when you're feeling down. Still a good recommendation though. So here we are, our final horror film of the 80s, and it isn't even a proper horror film. I will include it though, as it is terrifying at times. Dead Calm is about a couple called John and Ray, played by Sam Neill and Nicole Kidman, who go on holiday on a yacht as an attempt to cope with the loss of their son who died in a car accident, which seems to be a trend in these two films from '89. Eventually they come across a man in a rowing boat called Huey, played by Billy Zane, who claims that the schooner he was on is sinking and that everyone else on board died of food poisoning. John, feeling skeptical, takes the rowing boat back to the boat to investigate the scene. The first red flag is that Huey takes control of the yacht and leaves John to die at sea, kidnapping Ray. Upon reaching the sinking boat, John finds that it wasn't food poisoning that killed the people on board, but by Huey in a fit of rage, proven by the mangled corpses and the video proof on board, which also showed them verbally abusing Huey. The rest of the film separately follows Ray trying to survive on board a boat with a dangerously mentally ill man, and John trying to prevent the ship from sinking for as long as he can before he can make it back to the yacht. As I said, this is less of a horror film and more of a thriller. To be honest, I was hesitant to put it on the list at all. However, the gore of the bodies on board the sinking schooner and how scarily unhinged Huey is convinced me enough to give it a place. It's an amazing film, and I definitely recommend it a lot. Okay, so that was the top 20, but I also need to add some honourable mentions. So, let's have a look at the honourable mentions. Honourable mention number 1, Halloween 2, a faithful sequel to 1978 classic, and my favourite in the series. Scanners, a body horror masterpiece by David Cronenberg about people with telekinetic and telepathic powers. An American Werewolf in London, a horror comedy by John Landis about two American backpackers who get attacked by a werewolf. Reanimator, an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story where a scientist named Herbert West attempts to raise the dead with a new concoction. Day of the Dead, the third in George Romero's Dead trilogy, and Tom Savini's makeup masterpiece, where the world has now been taken over by the zombie hordes. The Mutilator, the only slasher film I've ever heard of with a sitcom intro. And finally, Society, where rich people turn out to be inhuman monsters which merge together in a process called the shunting. Right, so those are my honourable mentions, and without further ado, that is the end of this video. I really hope you've enjoyed this. This has taken a few days of working, but I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway guys, without further ado, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.